Myself, Mahesh Kumar Sharma, in B.N. Nursing College, Assistant Professor. My topic is the gastric juice. Our body have a stomach. Stomach are responsible for the secretions of the gastric juice. Stomach have the four part: fundus, body, antrum, and pylorus. Different part have the different functioning. Fundus have the only have the gases, and body is an important part of the stomach that responsible for the secretions of the gastric juice, and pylorus part are responsible food particle that store in stomach to release into the duodenum. Gastric juice is a secretions by the stomach in by and different cells that responsible for the secretion of the gastric juice, and gastric juice are help in the digestions of the different particle in gas by the individuals. Property of the gastric juice in one day secrete approximately 12,000 to 15,000 per day, and indirectly also called 2 ml to 3 ml per minute are secreted by the body of the stomachs, and that have the pH 2 to 3 pH that have the highly acidic. If the one finger are deep in gastric juice, that may be burned because that have the highly acidic environment. Composition of the gastric juice are compounded by the different particles. It can be divided into the two parts. Number one, mostly part of the gastric juice are formed by the waters. Water composition is the 99.5%, and other components are the solid substances. Solid substances have the different types particles that can be classified into the two types. Number one is organic, and number two is the inorganics. Organic substances have like gastric enzymes. Mainly three gastric enzymes are present in gastric juice: pepsin, gastric lipase, gelatins, and urinase. And third particles is the gastric mucin and intrinsic factor from of the organic substances of gastric juice. Inorganic components are the sodium, potassium, calcium, and hydrochloric acid, magnesium, iodine are present in gastric juice, and that are responsible for performing the different work. Function of the gastric juice are the perform different work. Number one, digestive functions. In gastric juice have the different enzyme that responsible for the digestions of the different particles. In gastric juice mainly protein are breakdowns partially by the pepsinogen enzyme. Pepsinogen enzyme are released by the parietal cell of the body of stomach, and in the acidic environment pepsinogen are converted in pepsin. Pepsin are act on the polypeptide and peptide bonds of the proteins and convert into the polypeptides, peptones, and amino acid in convert. Second function is the hemopoietic factors. Hemopoietic factors are released by the chief cell of the stomachs that responsible for the absorption of the extrinsic factors. Extrinsic factor are means vitamin B12, cytocobalamin are absorbed presence in intrinsic factor. If the deficiency of the intrinsic factor, person are suffer the pernicious anemia. It is a critical problem and mainly seen in the gastric operations persons. And third function is the protective functions. In gastric mucin are secreted by the globular cells and mucin cells that present in the mucosa of the stomach, and it protect the stomach from the auto digestions by the hydrochloric acids. So it is a protective coverings that made on the submucosa and mucosa layer that protect from the auto digestions by the hydrochloric acid. If the mucous secretions are problems, gastric mucins are proper not secret. In this condition, peptic ulcer, duodenal ulcers, and many conditions are appearing in the persons. And third is the hydrochloric acid secretions. Hydrochloric acid secretion is the very important that help in the partially digestions of the of the protein, and it activates the pepsinogen to it activates the pepsinogen into the pepsins, and pepsins are responsible to digestion of the proteins, or that convert the protein, complex protein, simple protein into the peptone, polypeptides and the peptones, and again it completely absorbed in the duodenums. Gastric secretions in our body depend on the autonomic nervous system and the reflexes. First reflex is the gastric reflex. Gastric reflex are occur when the food are reach in our stomachs, and that is and stimulate the receptor are present in the mucosa and submucosa of the gastric, and that help in the release of the gastric juice by the autonomic nervous systems, and nearest receptor are present that responsible for the secretions and help in the stimulate the nervous systems, and cephalic reflex are come when the persons come taking the foods, and autonomic nervous system are the control, and it can be classified into the two types. Number one, conditional and unconditional. Conditional when the persons taking any smells and having any smells related to food, in these conditions gastric secretions are stimulated by the condition. And second is the unconditioned. Unconditioned when persons not have any conditions but gastric secretions are released when after the saliva secretions. Gastric juice are released from the stomach. Stomach have the four parts in our body. Fundus is our part of the stomach that are connected to the esophagus. When the food person are engaged to food are rich in the stomach by the fundus that attach to the esophagus. Second part is the body. Body are the most common and most abundant part of the stomach that have the many type cells that mostly gastric juice are from by the body. Third part is the pylorus. Pylorus are the part that connect the stomach to duodenums. When the chyme are rich in the stomach, temporarily are stored for the partially digestion of the proteins, and after the chyme reach into the duodenum by the pylorus. Gastric juice are the secretions that released by the stomach and help in the digestion of the different particles present in the food that intake by the any individuals. Property. Gastric juice have the different type property. Approximately 12,000 to 15,000 ml release per day. Indirectly also called 2 to 3 ml per minute are released by the body of the stomachs, and that have the highly acidic environment. pH is the 2 to 3 pH. It is the very highly concentrated and highly strong acidic. If the person are dip the finger in the gastric juice, finger may be burned. Composition of the gastric juice. Gastric juice are made by the two components. Number one is the water. Gastric juice में mainly water 99.5% वाटर से मिलकर बना होता है, जबकि 0.5% सॉलिड कंपोनेंट से मिलकर बना होता है. सॉलिड कंपोनेंट्स को टू पार्ट्स में क्लासिफाई करते हैं. नंबर वन इज द ऑर्गेनिक. mainly gastric juice are made by the organic components. Organic components have the different particles. Number one is the gastric enzyme. It is a very important in gastric juice. Gastric enzyme have pepsin, gastric lipase, uridinase and gelatinase, and gastric mucosa and intrinsic factor that doing different work in the stomachs. Inorganic components, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium and bicarbonates are responsible for made up the inorganic part of the gastric juice. Functions of the gastric juice. Gastric juice doing the different work in our body. Number one, digestions. Digestions work are performed mainly gastric enzymes. Gastric enzyme Pepsinogen in active form of the pepsin that are released by the parietal cell of the stomach. When the pepsinogen come contact into the hydrochloric acid, it convert inactive form to active forms that help in the breakdown of the polypeptide bonds present in the proteins. So it partially break down the protein and convert the protein into the polypeptones, peptides and amino acid that completely absorb in the jejunum and ileum, that part of the small intestine. And kinase enzymes are present in animals that not help in digestion of milk in human beings. Protective functions, gastric mucin are released in the stomachs that help in the autodigestion of the gastric mucosa and submucosa by the hydrochloric acid, because hydrochloric acid have the high concentrations, so it can be autodigest the mucosal and submucosal walls of stomachs that protect. It is the continued release by the mucosal and submucosal layers, so it that have protective function. And next is the hemopoietic functions. Hemopoietic functions are performed by the chief cells of the stomach. Chief cells are released the intrinsic factor that help in the absorption of the extrinsic factor that called the cytocobaltamines, vitamin B12, that absorb in the presence of the intrinsic factor in the ileum. If the persons have the deficiency of the vitamin B12, you have to any gastric surgery. Persons are suffer from the pernicious anemia. It is a critical condition, and persons have the related to nervous system and symptoms. And fourth function is the hydrochloric acid secretions. Zymogen cells are responsible for secretion the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Hydrochloric acid are responsible for doing the different type functions. Number one function, it is stimulate the pepsinogen to convert in the pepsins. If the hydrochloric acid are not proper secrete, so protein are not absorbed completely into the completely digest into the stomachs. And second function is activate the different enzyme secretions in the stomach and duodenums. When the chyme reach from the stomach to intestine, it stimulate for the cytokinase enzyme that responsible the secretions of the bile and pancreatic juice in the second part of the duodenums. Mechanism of regulations of gastric juice. Gastric juice are the released for the different mechanism, and different substances are released in GIT that responsible for regulations of the gastric secretions. Number one is the gastrin. Gastrin is one important enzyme that released by the body of the stomachs. It stimulates the secretions of the gastric juice. When the persons intake the food, then gastrin are released that responsible for the secretion of the gastric juice. Histamine is a inflammatory component that stimulate the secretion of the gastric juice, and it doing the like a hormonal functions. And vagus nerve, it is the largest cranial nerve in our body that supply the all of GIT organs. When the vagus stimulate in parasympathetic conditions, gastric secretions are increased. Enterokinase enzyme are released from the second part of the duodenum. It responsible for the inhibit the gastric secretions. When the chymes are reach in the duodenums, and stimulate the enterokinase. Enterokinase inhibit the secretion of the gastric juice. Reflex of the gastric juice. The gastric secretions are regulated by the different reflexes in our body. Number one reflex is the cephalic reflex. Cephalic reflex that controlled by the head regionals and indirectly called to nervous systems. That controlled by the two conditions. Number one is the conditional. When persons intake the food, different type food intake by the any individual, in these conditions the taste receptor are present on the tongue that stimulate the taste receptor, and by the efferent sensory nerve transmit to the brain, and brain when the when they find out the nervous systems, and by the efferent nerve stimulate descend transmit the information to the receptor. In this condition, gastric juice are released by the nervous system. In unconditional condition, in this condition, when the persons feel the any smell and thinking about the foods and seen the foods, in this condition saliva are released in the mouth of the individual, and in this condition by the sensory nerve transmit the message from the brains, and when the brain are perceptions any food that release that transmit the message by the motor nerve, and it help in the release of the gastric juice. And third condition is the gastric condition. That condition are regulated by the nervous systems and the hormonal systems. Nervous system, when the person intake the food and so and reach in the stomachs, that food intake that convert in the chymes, and chyme are the responsible for stimulate the nervous systems. When the chyme are irritated in the gastric mucosa, that stimulate the sensations by the enteric reflex. Enteric reflex transmit by the sensory nerve into the spinal cord, and spinal cord finally reach the message on the brains, and brain after the perceptions transmit the information by the motor nerve to the enteric system, and enteric system transmit by the motor nerve to the gastric, and gastric receptor like different body of the gastric that help in the release the gastric juice. And by the hormones, gastrin and histamines, vagus nerve are responsible for the hormonal control of the gastric juice secretions. Intestinal, when the intestinal in these conditions, two systems are the responsible for the control of the gastric secretions. Number one is the nerve, and second is the hormonals. Different hormonal are released in the gastric, in the stomachs and the intestinal, like enterokinase, cystokinase, and intestinal inhibitor enzymes and gastric inhibitor enzymes. Four enzymes are responsible for the regulation of the entire gastric secretions. When the chyme are rich in the second part of duodenum, enterokinase enzyme are released, and this enzyme are responsible for inhibit the gastric secretions, and streptokinase enzyme are responsible when the food particles come contact into the second part of the duodenum. It stimulates the gastric secretions, and then it neutralizes in the duodenums. Gastric juice have the clinical importance when persons are suffer from the gastric surgery. In this condition, persons are take the supplementary gastric enzymes and hydrochloric acid, and when the mucin gastric mucin are completely not secretions, any abnormality in the secretion. In this condition, acidity problems commonly are seen in individuals, and regurgitations, heartburns, psoriasis, many conditions are seen in persons. Thank you.